sex-based discrimination. India had already ratified the Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and this judgment coming forth was another pin in the wall, which solidified our India's outlook towards prevention of sexual harassment. Under this law, under this judgment, certain guidelines were put in place, including how the employer has to take good steps to prevent such instances and redress such instances, and has to form complaints committee also. Soon thereafter, in 2013, the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act came into effect in December 2013. 1 year after that infamous incident, which truly shook the entire nation of the Nirbhaya rape case. After that incident, a lot of changes were actively protested, and there were a lot of activism going on regarding it, which also led to changes in the criminal laws, and sexual harassment also became a specific instance, a specific penal instance under the Indian Penal Code. However, even though now it has been approximately 7 years, it will be 7 years in this December 2020, to this law coming into effect, there are still challenges which are being faced by courts every day, still instances which come before it for interpretation. Through case laws, we look into these interpretations of the court and how the court expands the ambit of certain terms such as workplace, goes into the depth of how the committee was constituted and whether it was constituted properly or not, so that whether the report formed by such a properly or improperly constituted committee stands the test of law or not. So in our previous session, all those who were there with us, just a quick recap of what cases that we had covered. We had covered a 2008 judgment of the Delhi High Court in Saurabh Kumar Malik versus the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, in which we saw how the Delhi High Court in fact extended the whole definition of workplace and said that it does not restrict to the office complex, but it also extends to other places where employees are. In the specific case, it was an incident happening at the adjoining mess or residential quarters of certain colleagues who were there at the academy. Well, interesting part about this case was where it also extended it to a home of a CEO where there might be work getting done. So a residents cannot be coming out of the purview of the workplace, as well as whenever people are interacting through information technology, which is the case today. So this 2008 judgment was quite a landmark incident in the whole interpretation of the law, even before the law coming into effect, because it extended the whole ambit of workplace. In this another landmark judgment, very prominent, Punita Kesodi versus Union of India, another Delhi High Court judgment, we saw the test of a reasonable woman, in which the court very quickly said that, okay, it's not necessary that there has to be a touch, there has to be something which is a sexual demand or sexual favor, but if all the circumstances taken into consideration also fall under a sex-based discrimination bracket, it could be sexual harassment, and it has to be taken into account that a reasonable woman who might find these instances as harassing has the right to come forward to it and also has the right to get these claims adjudicated. Principles of natural justice. We saw a judgment of the Gujarat High Court of 2016. Principles of natural justice are a very, very wide term. In fact, today again, we have lined up a judgment of principles of natural justice and going into a little bit nuanced aspect of it. Principles of natural justice are not at all under a straitjacket formula. They differ. They have varied instances of how people are heard properly, how the complaint was redressed properly, whether everybody got an opportunity to put their witnesses, whether everybody got the opportunity to cross-examine witnesses. In this particular instance, there was no complaint shared, cross-examination was not done, the proper reply was not taken. The last case that we discussed in our previous session was the external member who, as per the POSH law, this was one of the recent cases of Delhi High Court of 2018. In fact, it went all the way to the Supreme Court as well. In this, there was a contention placed that the external member belonged to the employers association, and the question put forth by the complainant to ascertain the independence and impartiality of this external member was not answered correctly. Even before the court, it wasn't answered correctly. the external member in this case was a labor lawyer, but did not have any concrete evidence to prove that they were also from, in the field of sexual harassment, or had been doing work to prevent sexual harassment, or were associated with an NGO, or were promoted or were dedicated to the cause of women, which are these three categories to make sure that when we are selecting an external member, they have to fit into one or the other category. We have a very good recording of it on our channel on YouTube. If you can go to YouTube and check out Ungender Legal Advisory, you will come across this session's video, and happy to get your comments on the video as well. So we can know what cases to, what comments to answer, any questions that come up, and what cases to probably take for our next session if we get any feedback on what kind of cases do you want to see. So let's start our session for today. Our first case is one of the well-known cases in this field of, in the subject matter of prevention of sexual harassment. It was on the quorum, the maintenance of quorum throughout the proceedings, and also the how the IC, the constitution of it, and the collaboration between the IC affects the whole the judgment of the IC, as well as the veracity and the validity of an inquiry report. This is Jaya Kotare versus Rastasan Tukaji Maharaj, Nagpur University, Bombay High Court, Nagpur bench case of 2014. Very quickly, the facts of the case. There were petitions filed by certain assistant professors of Science College, which was a senior science college for graduate students, and they had filed complaints regarding sexual harassment. But at that point of time, no committee under the POSH law was constituted. In fact, they were also victimized, and they were transferred by orders dated of 2013. And they, in fact, then filed this writ petition to constitute the internal they filed a petition to constitute the internal complaints committee before the colleges, and the internal complaints committee was constituted in July 2013. This case was already ongoing before the High Court, because the whole issue of the IC not being constituted on time had reached the High Court during that time, and one of the interim orders of the High Court was, in fact, to constitute the IC. And they said that finish the constitution of the IC and provide us with the inquiry report. Now, unfortunately, the court received two separate packets of the inquiry report in January 2014. There was an inquiry report submitted separately by the presiding officer, and there was an inquiry report separately submitted by the NGO member along with the signatures of two other members. Now, what was the primary contention in Jaya Kotare's case? The quorum was not there properly. According to the IC proceedings, the petitioners pointed out that the NGO member never attended the committee properly. She was always late. And because of her late reporting, a lot of what transpired between the parties and a lot of what transpired during the proceedings were not attended by her. So technically, the quorum which should have been maintained was never maintained. And the fact that there was a separation in the reports was also because of the fact that there was no collaboration and no cooperation between the members. And the NGO member, in fact, wrote a separate report in which the signs of the other two members, the employee members, were put in the report, but there was no statements given by them. There was no application of mind given by the other two members that they were in agreement, or they had different views, or what according to them went, or what according to them was wrong, or what according to them was right. So this NGO member report also, apart from the separate report of the presiding officer, seemed to be another non-collaborative, non-cooperative report in which only the NGO members' views were pointed out. There were other contentions also raised in this case regarding one of the members who was, in fact, there was complaints filed against him for harassment also. So he should not have been there on the board. And there was a pending inquiry against him before the police, so his nomination was not valid. Another contention put forth in this case was that one of the other employee female members was a probationer, not a confirmed employee, and was in fact a weak employee because of being not confirmed and being on the probation side. Had the the scare of being removed at any point of time, or being under the influence of management. And this quorum was, this whole constitution and the quorum was not proper. The constitution was not selected properly for the contentions. What did the High Court hold in this case? It did acknowledge that because of the NGO member coming late, the presiding officer was in minority because there were only other two weak members. It did not go into the whole aspect of the second contentions and the third contentions, which we saw that the first member was the employee member was in fact going through a police inquiry, and the second one was a probationer. It did not go into it and it did not adjudicate upon it, but it did acknowledge and realize that these are weak members. And by the NGO member not being present in the quorum, the presiding officer was put at a disadvantage. And in fact, the NGO members, presence in the committee, presence in the quorum is very important from the aspect of maintaining independence and impartiality, so that nobody from the institute or nobody from the organization comes under the whole, the control or the supervision or the whole, the at the back of their mind, it wouldn't be like if we give a decision to this management, we may be at jeopardy. That is where the NGO member is very crucial to be kept in the quorum. And by this NGO member coming late, there was a lot of disadvantage to this whole proceeding. The another aspect of the court finding in Jaya Kotade's case is very important to note, that because of the non-cooperation, because of the non-collaboration between the members, there were two reports. There cannot be two reports. It has to be a combined report. Whether few members disagree or agree, at the end of the day, the majority opinion, the majority recommendation comes forth. But by being separate inquiry reports, the whole process is vitiated because nobody is working together, nobody is cooperating with each other, nobody comes forth as one permanent body looking into the complaints of sexual harassment. In fact, the court went on to say that the IC is one entity where there are total of four members. A report or a decision by the majority is not ruled out. But when the IC is a single committee, there's provision for quorum. It is expected to function as a single body. Therefore, without taking any joint collaborations, any joint deliberations into account, the whole IC report is void and unacceptable. That's why the decision of the High Court was, in fact, the constitution and the entire quorum, the entire proceeding was found to be illegal, and the reports could not be relied upon. They, in fact, asked the colleges to reconstitute the ICC and put the report and do the inquiry again, prepare the report again, and place it before the court. And this was in fact given at a very, very strict timeline by the court to be constituted within 10 days and to submit its report within 30 days. Now, what's the rule which accounts into here? The quorum is contained in our POSH rules, Rule 7.7, manner of inquiry into complaint. In conducting the inquiry, a minimum of 3 members of the complaints committee, including the presiding officer or the chairperson as the case may be, shall be present. An interesting part about the quorum, and Pallavi, jump in whenever you wish to, is about, I feel, is about the lack of gender balance in the quorum, or the requirement to have gender balance, which is already there in the ICC. So I feel that there is scope for discussion over here of how should this quorum in fact be. Pallavi, can it be an all women quorum? Or does it still need the gender balance, which technically the IC needs to have, like half the members are male, half the members are female. So it becomes a very good gender balanced forum. And the quorum being 3 members, it only says 3 members. So it does not say whether it has to be 3 members which are female or male. What does it say? Pallavi, you're on mute.
I'm on mute. No, I think one of the best things about reading, law, what I have realized is that you have to keep reading it in a combination form. right? You have to
Exactly.
understand the larger intent, what the law wanted to, aim at, and then you have to keep looking at each and every section and see whether there's an alignment or whether there's any contradiction, right? So if we go back to the composition of the IC, right, where it says that at least 50% should be women, right? That's where it is leaving room for other genders to be part of it,
Yeah.
right? Second, it is asking the committee to perform in a unbiased and fair and impartial manner. It's asking the committee to follow the principles of natural justice, where each party will get the fair opportunity to be heard, where there will be no discrimination and no judgment, and all those things will be absolutely absent there. And that's precisely the intent that it expects during the quorum selection also, that if the whole point of being a combination of genders of committee members is required to maintain a fair and impartial proceedings, then how can the quorum not have it? I mean, we surely cannot expect that each and every aspect will be written word by word, that when you're selecting a quorum, make sure that there's a gender balance there also,
Mm.
right? But we have to read it like that. Now most of
Yeah.
the time what happens is that just taking the thought forward from what you said, these things are not done in an official manner, right? When a
Mm.
complaint comes in, what is the general proceeding with the IC members is that let us all meet, you know and let us start discussing the case. And then as and when members are available, as long as the 3-member requirement is fulfilled, committees continue with the proceedings. Now,
Mm.
what this judgment is telling us, which is more in a specific manner, is that first and foremost, you need to know your quorum. Right
Yeah.
now, how will you know your quorum is by formalizing it. So, a standard or a good practice will be when you receive a complaint, maybe shoot out an email to your members and tell them that we have received a complaint. And for companies which have different locations and committees, maybe they can identify where the complaint has come in from, where the respondent is from, to identify which members actually are required to be part of these proceedings. That's
Yeah.
number one, right? To complete the member requirement. Second is from this judgment, what we hear is that there was also conflict of interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, law is saying that you should be fair and you should be unbiased and you should be impartial. But how do you know? It's a very subjective thing. And look at this particular judgment. All the efforts were done, all the meetings were done, even two separate, final inquiry reports were also
Reports.
presented,
Yeah.
and yet it all went down the drain just because certain things were missed out. So the
Mm.
second thing would be, as a good practice, to ask those members outright whether you have any specific conflict of interest, right? And that conflict of interest could be in so many ways. One very simply pointed out here is, if a particular member is in a probation, of course that person is going to find it difficult to rule not in favor of the
Yeah.
organization and think about that individual more. So these quick hacks, if we can put as part of our SOPs for ICs, they go a long way, and documenting everything. Because today you may ask me in person in a meeting that, Pallavi, you don't have any conflict of interest, right? And I will tell you, yes, I don't. But perhaps it's important for you to first explain to me what can be
What?
possible areas of conflict of interest that could be, and then getting a declaration from me, maybe as as uh, as close to official as it can be over an email, if not through a proper declaration form signing or something. But you are giving me an opportunity to reflect whether I stand in a conflicted zone or not. And
Yes.
then closing the quorum and then making sure that whoever has chosen to be part of this investigation will commit to all the meetings. Otherwise, you are going to end up, perhaps maybe in some other future judgment, we will have those cases mentioned out that the quorum kept changing. Think of it as a civil court proceeding. How often have we seen a designated judge changing in an
Judge being
approach,
changed. Yes.
right? So
Exactly.
these are the learnings, I think, good practices that can be put in place in the organization as we read through these judgments. So my 2 cents on
Absolutely.
this.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But Suruchi,
Oh.
just wanted to ask one more thing. There was something in the beginning about the IC not being there when the investigation happened, right? And that's
Yes.
something that perhaps we can reiterate, because we covered similar judgment last time also.
Yeah, so in fact, there was the writ petition which was filed in fact to get the IC into place. So the court mandated the IC to come into effect and then take the inquiry forward. In fact, we will now see a judgment where how does the limitation fall into place when there is no IC into already constituted as at an organization. So in this case also, although it was court effected IC, because the writ petitioners were quite aggrieved and they were transferred and victimized for filing these complaints, is where the court said that no, there should be a fair procedure, a fair inquiry to be held by the IC, and the reports to be submitted to the court itself in sealed packets. Now, let's move on, especially because we've touched upon the topic of IC not being there in the organization. Let's go on to how does it affect if the IC is not there at the organization and a person wants to file a sexual harassment complaint. If it comes a little later, how does it affect the limitation period? Because the POSH law there has a very strict limitation period on filing of the complaint. Let's go through a judgment of the Allahabad High Court, Vishwesh Dayal Srivastava versus the Union of India of 2015. The facts of this case are in 2009, this petitioner, Vishwesh Dayal Srivastava, was appointed as a librarian at IIT Kanpur, and this post is equivalent to a post and it falls under the same cadre as a professor. 4 complaints were filed against him, against his behavior by both sets of genders, female and male. It was not necessarily female. But yes, the first complaint which we see over here of 19th September 2014 was filed by a female employee against him for harassment. Now, because there were so many complaints which were filed against him, a 4-member committee was set up by IIT Kanpur to look into these complaints and identify the nature of these complaints and see whether what action needs to be taken in these complaints. And because one of the complaints which was filed, which was an initial complaint which was filed of 19 September 2014 was a harassment complaint, this committee forwarded it to the women cell of IIT Kanpur. In fact, during this period only, the complainant had filed a complaint of victimization on 19th of May 2014. The women's cell constituted an IC on 10th of September 2014. Do note the gap of 1 year. Although the complaint or the initial complaint of harassment was filed a year ago, in fact on 19/9/2013, and a second complaint of victimization was filed in May 2014. The IC was only constituted a year later, in September 2014, and it did its investigation a year later. In February 2015, IC said that yes, the charges were established, and it sent the report to IIT to take appropriate action. The inquiry committee of the IIT, the disciplinary committee that is, issued a show cause notice to the petitioner, the Vishwesh Dayal Srivastava, a few days later, 2-3 days later, and suspended him and divested him of his power assets at the institute. Now, the petitioner in this case did not file any response to the show cause notice, but immediately proceeded to file a writ petition before the High Court of Allahabad on the ground. The primary contention was that this whole case, the whole complaint, the whole proceeding was barred by limitation under the POSH law. So let's see at the primary contention. As per the petitioner, the whole complaint should have been within the timelines which are prescribed under Section 9 of the POSH law. And this matter coming forth after 1 year, which is in 2014, means that the complaint has already exceeded the period of limitation and thus cannot be taken up by the IC, and any action or any proceeding taken up by the IC is entirely illegal. On the counter argument by the respondent, it was argued that the question of complaint not being accepted and being beyond the period of limitation cannot come into place as the IC was not at all there at that point of time. So what did the court find? What did the court hold? And as we saw, the only issue before the court was that it was barred by limitation. It acknowledged that the The IC was created only a year later on 10 September 2014. And in fact, because the IC was never there, the whole plea of limitation cannot come into effect to vitiate the complaint, especially the court acknowledged, especially because she was already pursuing the matters before the authorities, even before the enforcement of the act. Now, we saw that on 19/9/2013, she had filed a complaint. A few months later, in May 2014, she did file another complaint of victimization. So, in fact, she was pursuing this whole instance. This whole instance of harassment was being pursued by her by a very long time. And in fact, what the court held was, very interestingly, it said that even though the act came into place in 2013 December, even though the IC was set into place at the IIT Kanpur in 2014, it does not mean the woman was not protected. It means that there was already a women's cell which was created at the organization prior to the coming of the act as per the Vishakha guidelines, and she came forward with her complaints, with her specific complaint of victimization. It's not like she did not come forward at all. Therefore, this whole complaint, this whole issue about the complaint being beyond the period of limitation has to be politely turned down. In fact, as also we can see over here, was that there was a system of redressal already there before the act coming into place, which was the Vishakha guidelines. Interestingly, Vishakha guidelines for filing of the complaint does not have a limitation period. Therefore, if she started filing a complaint 1 year before, she was filing it under, you can say that she was filing it under the Vishakha guidelines. And even though the IC was not there at that point of time, and the IC came, it does not mean that she is divested of her right to file a complaint. While we do have the new law into place after Vishakha guidelines that came into law, the POSH law, it does say that it has to be filed within 3 months, but it does not, in this facts of the case, in the present circumstances which were before the Allahabad High Court, the vested right of action could not be taken away from the lady. Yes, it came to a full final decision that the matter was not time barred, and the IC's report finding him to be, which had established the charges of sexual harassment, can be appealed against at the appropriate forum. In fact, he was asked to reply to the show cause notice, and his petition was dismissed. What does just to recap, while we saw the 3-month period, just to recap, what does the POSH law state? Section 9(1) is the law which talks about the filing of the complaint of sexual harassment. It gives a woman the right to file a complaint of sexual harassment within the period of 3 months from the date of incident, and in case of series of incident within the period of 3 months from the date of last incident. However, if there are any reasons for delay, which should be provided to the IC, and the IC, after deliberating over it and also writing the reasons for accepting such complaints beyond the first period of 3 months, it can still accept complaints so far as it, again, the extended period does not exceed 3 months. So over here, we see a very strict period of limitation being given by the POSH law. But because of the fact that when the the complainant in our case, in this Allahabad High Court case, had filed a complaint when the IC was not there, that did not prevent her from coming forward to the IC.
So if we can expound a little bit on it. So what exactly does it mean for organizations now, right? Because a lot of companies have, as recent as I would say last week, they are yet to constitute their committees, and maybe for the next 1 year, or for the next 6 months, they may not receive any complaints. So if we have to go by this judgment, then what it means is the past 6 years that the law has been in the picture, any incident that has happened, should they go back and actually make it communicate it to all their employees that if something has happened in the past 6 years, then they can still bring it, because according to this judgment they can, right? The absence of a committee does not really mean that you can continue to follow the 3 months plus 3 months timeline that is provided in the law. So that's the first thing, that that is a good practice, once again, to adopt as a learning from this particular judgment. And second is, Vishaka guidelines have been in place since 1997.
97, yes.
So if we have to read this judgment correctly then, and in the same accordance, then since 1997, if Vishaka guidelines have been in place and there is a redressal mechanism, and companies do need to recognize actions under workplace sexual harassment under the POSH Act, should we go back to 1997 and look at it from that long?
I'll in fact differ over here. Why this judgment was this judgment, based on my understanding and interpretation of it. The case, the first harassment complaint was in fact filed in September 2013, and the law came into effect in December 2013. Pursuant to the law, the IC was formed. So technically, as soon as the law comes into effect, the first responsibility is the IC has to be formed, and then the rules start applying, and the act starts applying to that IC, and all the whole procedure from the complaint to the redressal, completion of redressal mechanism. It is because of the peculiar circumstances of that case that because the women were still protected under the Vishaka guidelines. Today, if somebody has to come forward, the women has to be protected under the POSH law, and technically should be filing the complaint within this timeline only, because now the law has been in place since past 6.5, 7 years, so to speak.
We are only I feel 6 years then.
Yeah. So that's what. Yes.
Okay. So just capturing the good practice once again, going in line with the judgment, that even if a company has constituted a committee as latest as, let's say, tomorrow, then it will be good to communicate or to include in the communication and awareness sessions that if somebody has experienced any incident since 2014 January, or December 2013, then the committee is still open to taking it, not just because they're doing a good gesture, but clearly through judgments like these, we can say that if tomorrow somebody chooses to go to the court, it is going to come up as a violation or as a non-compliance of the law. Two things will get highlighted immediately. It's not non-compliance, but it is also a violation of the guidelines of the law.
Law, yes.
Okay, great.
Do we want to take any questions at this point of time?
I do have 2 questions on the screen, if we can take that up, and I will request everybody else, if they have any questions, please raise your hand, so we will just call you out. Rituparna, you have mentioned 2 questions here. Do you want to say them? Suruchi, are you able to read the questions?
One second, I'll just open the chat. Yeah. Hi, Rituparna. Yeah, sorry, you want to speak the question?
I can just, in fact, just say. So, for example, if the head of an organization, like say, like a managing director or a CEO level, is accused of sexual harassment by an employee, and he decides, he chooses not to cooperate. For whatever reason, he chooses to exercise his power and not to, cooperate for an internal investigation. Then what is the scope of justice, number one? And how can an external member in such a case can step in and ensure that justice is done? Because an external member often is also dependent on the company for work. So there's some, some bias sets in. And in the second case is when often, like say a person has been accused of sexual harassment, they choose to leave the company instantly and move on to a new place of employment, in which case it has happened that the complainant has found it extremely difficult to pursue the complaint with a new organization.
Okay. Suruchi, I'll just add some points on the first one and then complement it with your experience, please.
Absolutely.
So for the first one, that's exactly why there's a provision mentioned in the law that number one, no individual who is recognized as a owner or as a head of the organization, one should be part of the committees, right? Only because they themselves it will be very difficult to have an impartial investigation if that is the case. But even in cases where there is a complaint against the head of the institution, the complaints should not be handled by internal committees. They should go to the local complaints committee. And that's the
Correct.
role that is required. That's the responsibility which is given to an external member as an unbiased party, that in any situation like these, in fact, this is one component which should be heavily enforced when IC trainings are happening and when in management and leadership orientation sessions are happening, that as and when any complaint comes in where either the complainant or the respondent is head of the institution or even recognized as head of the institution, they should be right away taken to the local complaints committee, and that's the solution, or that's the provision that exists. Suruchi, any other thoughts around this?
No, that's correct, Pallavi. Exactly right, Rituparna, because you cannot have the internal committee of the organization looking at a complaint against your own boss, because the presiding officer is a senior employee of that organization, and the other two members are also senior employee of the organization, which is where as soon as such a complaint arises, it goes out completely out of the organization and is handled by the local committee, which is formed under the district officer of that place.
Yeah, yeah. And for the second problem, it's quite common that people, when there's a complaint against them, they're either on the verge of leaving the organization. If they're on the verge of leaving the organization, a good practice which should be covered during HR orientation sessions and IC briefings. And it's also a crucial part about how interconnected IC processes are with the rest of the HR processes, is that the relieving process should be put on hold. But let's say that somebody has already left the organization and you no longer have that control. The good practice and effective practice is to reach out to the IC of their organization and let them know that there's a member from their organization who is party to this. However, that is also questionable. However, there's no judgment around it. Maybe IC may be construed as violating some of the confidentiality, but it all depends on how confidential guidelines or how confidentiality guidelines are drafted for both the organizations. But the third effective way is to communicate it directly to the person that there is a complaint of sexual harassment against them, and even though they are no longer part of the same organization, they are still mandated by the law. It's a summon, right? The committee, when they reach out to any individual, they are not just sending an email or a WhatsApp message. Everything is a legal communication, and when the court summons you, you have to respond and you have to appear. There is no other way around it. But practically, Suruchi, what do you suggest are the challenges and how can we go about them?
No, you completely covered them, Pallavi. Exactly. First, put their release on hold as far as possible. Second would be, try to get cooperation from the other organization, but definitely keeping the confidentiality aspect in mind. And third is cooperation from the respondent itself. And if they do breach the whole cooperation aspect of it, the complaint will go as per the law, which is either the decision is given ex parte, and if the complainant doesn't cooperate, then the decision is the whole committee is the complaint proceeding is terminated. So the cooperation aspect is also a practical challenge, but as far as possible, because IC has been given the powers, some of the powers of a civil court, it can make sure that it implements to the best in cases where it cannot manage to hold back, or the company cannot manage to hold back the respondent in these cases.
Right. So there's an extended question that has come up, Suruchi, by Colonel Dilip Sopori, that if the respondent is the CEO and if there's a need to provide security or protection to the complainant, whose responsibility and accountability is it to bear the cost of it?
I would think, Pallavi, tell me what are your views on it also. In this case, because the local committee is taking these proceedings up, probably the complainant or whoever is needing the protection should directly tell this to the local committee, and the local committee, in collaboration with local enforcement agencies, can provide protection in these cases. Whoever is needing should inform that directly to the local committee, because now it's gone out of the company, now it's gone out of the IC's whole jurisdiction also. So
Right.
even in this case, cooperation from the IC is not something that anybody will be able to seek, and there may be also chances of other people stepping in, the local committee's authority. What are your views on this?
Yeah, practically, see, it's easy for law to say that you now have the freedom and the right to go and complain, whereas practically there are so many challenges around it.
Yeah.
And this concern that Colonel Dilip has just specified, we have seen it in many of our cases also, where this has become a huge issue. Safety and security does become a huge issue. In this one, practically, maybe navigating it through this channel would be helpful. That see, somewhere the local complaints committee can reach out to two entities, one to the company directly, right, and telling them that there's a concern which is raised by them. And once again, local complaints committee also, when they're communicating, it is not just an email or a piece of paper. It is also once again a legal document and a legal binding, right, reminding them of their duty, that somebody has already experienced sexual harassment in your organization, and while they are seeking justice and the recourse, they are also concerned about their safety, and the company should take certain measures to ensure that no such harm will come to the complainant. However, on the second hand, if this is not this does not lead to any productive output, reaching out to the district officer is another thing that will be pretty useful, because if you don't understand it from the from the local committee, you will definitely be able to understand it from the district officer's point of view, who has the higher authority, right, in terms of enforcing the guidelines of POSH Act. And these are the two provisions that I would suggest will be pretty useful. And cost is something that should be borne by the company at the end of the day.
Mm.
If not
Yeah.
upfront, then later on, however it can be made doable. But the cost and the burden is definitely on the company.
Yes, I would agree so too, Pallavi.
Enforcing it will be a little difficult, because a company is still governed and still following the instructions of the main employer, right? So
Yeah.
if it's a single promoter run business, then yes, it is very challenging. But let's see, most of the companies right now have a person who is identified as the owner, and then you have a group of people as board who are backing them up, right? So that if you can identify who exactly is the nominated owner and where exactly other decision making powers lie, you can reach out to those authorities also.
True. Yes, I think that would be the only couple of these things to follow whenever these kind of issues come up.
Yes, yes. So no more questions at this part. I don't see anything
Yeah,
that in that window.
I think we should move on to let's
If I may
also
just
quickly.
share, I'm sorry to interrupt. If I may just share a personal observation that I've had based on about more than 50 cases that I've investigated on sexual harassment. Just an observation. I thought it would be good to share also because I noticed out of the 10 participants, there are only two men attending this. So probably it's even more relevant here in this case. There was a mention made about maintaining gender balance in the quorum.
Right.
In every case that I've investigated, without exception, my personal observation based on my interactions with the IC members was, if I may put it very simply, the women IC members, consciously or unconsciously, the correct term is cognitive bias, tend to think against the complainant, against a woman employee, and the men IC members tend to think based on the cognitive bias against the men witnesses and the respondents. So I think this is a very important point to bear in mind, because without exception, every case, and I've highlighted this, no matter how hard you try not to be biased, no matter how experienced a person is in the IC, this thing, but the typical thinking is, I'm a woman, I know what's going on in her mind, she must have trapped him. And the typical psyche of the men is, I know this guy, I know what's going on in his mind, I know this guy must have played that victim card and trapped her. So I think it would be good to keep this in mind. That's all. Thanks.
No, thank you so much, Colonel Support,
Yes.
sharing your inputs, because one of them, and I would not say that this is incorrect, right? Because all of us have our experiences when it comes to how ICs, how IC members, both internal and external, other than the knowledge that they are bringing to these investigation processes, what's more important than the knowledge is what is the thought process that they are bringing, or rather, let me put it more bluntly, what is the thought process that they're leaving outside the investigation rooms,
Yeah.
right? Because
Exactly.
when you
Exactly.
walk in, yes, you need to remember what the law is asking you to do. You need to remember certain, of course, these case laws. You need to remember. You need to remember what are the technicalities. But what you do need to forget is what happened in some other case, right? So that you will look at this particular situation in an isolated mode. It's extremely difficult. We are dealing with human behavior here. And, but once any company, and this is once again a good practice, right? Once any company has crossed through imparting legal knowledge and cases related knowledge to their committee members, they should heavily invest in addressing these behavioral development of the committee members. What kind of biases do they have? What kind of judgments they are carrying forward? And these biases and judgments are not just limited to genders, right? We are talking about somebody being from from a specific region in the country and immediately making a conclusion that if this person is from this particular state, then they must be like this. Or if somebody is from a smaller town, they must be extremely sensitive, or they are not used to the modern ways of work culture. So many aspects that contribute to the thought process or the lens that we are bringing with ourselves. And it's a continuous process. A 2 or 3 hour session on bias addresser is not going to address it.
Yes. So sorry. So the key takeaway would be firstly to maybe ensure that there is a balance in the IC committee
Yes.
members,
Yes.
and before the findings are put down on paper, it would be good for the members to discuss it extensively to ensure that the biases are eliminated. They should share their views openly, express it, so that there's better understanding of what are the reasons for their conclusions.
No,
Thank you.
absolutely. As a good practice for an external member, I would suggest this thing, or the chairperson, is that whenever you receive a complaint, you first have a meeting internally with all the members that have been appointed or chosen for the quorum, and get a sense of what are the reactions. Because if any internal member immediately in the first meeting itself, before even meeting any of the parties, is already saying, is already making declarative statements and conclusive statements, and sharing that, oh, I have known this person for some time, I think this person would have done this, or I don't think this person would have done this. If they're already bringing these elements even before meeting the parties, then that person is already bringing their biases in the room. And this is just the first step to begin with. So while I agree with you that the decision should be done the decision should be made in a discussive manner, but even the selection of the quorum members should be able to filter these individuals out.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for raising this very important point. Appreciate
Thanks
it.
a lot.
Suruchi, anything you have to say else? Please go ahead.
No, a very good point put forth. Exactly what we had to discuss from a quorum aspect of gender balance, which people don't understand is required for eliminating bias overall also.
Yeah.
So I think we can move on to the next two judgments very quickly. Let's now look at another aspect of principles of natural justice, because how much ever we look at it, it's not enough. It's still, because it does not come under a straitjacket formula, it has a lot of aspects to it, a lot of nuances to it. And this is a very interesting case of Manjeet Singh versus Indraprastha Gas Limited, High Court of Delhi of 2016. Manjeet Singh, Senior Executive Secretary, filed a short complaint of sexual harassment against him on 8th of February 2016, and the detailed facts of the whole complaint came in 2 days later, 2-3 days later, on 11th February. According to the the complainant in this case, Manjeet Singh, she had gone on Republic Day, 26th of January. They had gone to the office for celebrations, Republic Day celebrations. Because of being the executive secretary to the petitioner, she saw him enter his cabin and she went up to say hello to him. Then he started chit chatting. He had recently been on a trip to Iran, and so he said that I will, according to the complainant, he said that I will show you pictures of Iranian girls. They are very fun-loving and they do not mind clicking pictures with us. He, in fact, also clicked as per the complainant, he clicked a picture of her without informing her. He also showed her pictures of Gurdwara that he had seen in Iran, and he was quite fascinated by the fact. He kept, as per the complainant, he kept on talking about the attitude of Indian girls and how they are, not fun-loving and not like Iranian girls. As per the complainant, he also kept commenting on the fact that "tu sundar hai, kya tu pat gayi mujhse." These statements came out apparently during this exchange which happened on the Republic Day at IGL office. According to the complainant, he also tried to shake her hand before leaving, and he went up for a hug, but then she completely she ran away from the cabin. As for her, she narrated these incidents to the HR of the company and also tried to get hold of a senior employee of the company to take guidance on how to deal with this. She also sought leave from the petitioner, being her boss, but he kept on berating her, saying that she takes too many leaves, and his dismissive tone upset her. She then ended up filing the complaint. Now, the complaint found him to be guilty, but what went wrong? Um, Major thing that went wrong, there was no cross examination. They were, in fact, put together in front of each other and they were asked to cross question each other. That is not how the law goes. They are required to put questions towards each other and cross examine. But that's a whole different procedure. It's not just putting you and I together and we questioning each other. That does not is not how it functions. The second thing that went wrong was the witness statements did not corroborate at all with the statement of the complainant. There was no proof, there was no circumstantial evidence to give a proof that something like this had happened. Yet, the IC found the petitioner guilty in its report of 2016. Now, what did the High Court hold over here? High Court was completely cross with the fact that there was no cross-examination. It said that for the delineation of the truth, orderly conduct of cross-examination is essential. In fact, it used orderly conduct. The procedure cannot be reduced or relegated to a farce where two parties are just put in front of each other and left to the mercy of each other, where one is shouting, one is screaming, and is also many times the articulation and the expressions that they use are demeaning towards each other, and there could be domineering attitude. The High Court felt that this was not at all the way how the investigation should have been conducted. It did take into account that there are no strict rules of procedure to apply in these cases. Everything differs from facts and circumstances of the case. Sensitivities differ. Principles of natural justice, however, are malleable, but they have to be applied. Therefore, a modicum of order of conduct of cross-examination has to be there for to give the process any credibility. The adherence of to forms of natural justice is both quasi-judicial and administrative in nature, and there cannot be a fair play in the inquiry if the principles of natural justice have not been applied to that inquiry. And this would vitiate the entire proceeding. In fact, it was not denied by the IC in IGL that they did not cross-examine, but they let the parties cross-question each other. And the court held that this because of this whole process not being done properly and the cross-examination not being allowed properly, it did vitiate the proceeding. Now let's see another aspect of the circumstantial evidence and the non-corroboration of the victim's statement with the complainant's statement. The IC report said that it has not found the petitioner guilty of charge leveled against him. However, the behavior that he did, flirtatious or apparently according to the complainant, where he transgressed the lines of acceptable behavior, was enough for the IC to come to the conclusion that he did commit this act. But there was nothing at all brought on record to support the said inference. So therefore, the court held that even though the so-called circumstantial evidence is not seen, the committee could not have come to a conclusion that the sexual harassment was proven. It cannot. So while we see this, we understand that it's a very different it's a very different reaction for a person going through sexual harassment. The court did acknowledge that a woman might just go under shock. She might not be able to immediately inform anybody else, and she would want to seek redressal for it. And this is exactly what the IC is there. But however, without proof, without evidence, without corroboration of the statements, any person cannot be just put on the stand and said that yes, you committed the sexual harassment. Any person who cannot be proven guilty. He's always presumed innocent till he's proven guilty. So this evidence over here, because of not being corroborated with the statements, could not have been a reason for the IC coming up to the conclusion that sexual harassment was proven. The decision of the court was very straightforward. Because they were not corroborated, the complaint with the witness statements, the committee could not have come to the conclusion that sexual harassment was in fact there, and it could not have been sustained. The whole decision of the committee could not have been sustained. And in fact, because the right to cross-examine was not given to the respondent, the proceeding itself suffered from legal infirmity, and everything given by the IC was to be set aside. Now, where does the principles of natural justice come? The principles of natural justice under POSH law come under Rule 7.4, in which the complaints committee has been given the power to inquire into a complaint in accordance with principles of natural justice. As we also saw in our previous webinar, there is no straitjacket formula. It could be from fair opportunity to be given, cross-examination, depose without any fear or retaliation, transparency of all submissions, and no bias or unfair treatment in the investigation. All of these fall under the bucket of principles of natural justice, and differ. How you implement it into every case differs from facts and circumstances of every case. Pallavi, any thoughts? Any questions?
No, in fact, I wanted to go a little deeper, perhaps take 2 minutes in this one. So, Ruchi, on what are our thoughts when it comes to informing one during the awareness session? Because this is a question that comes very, very frequently, right? That if we do not have any proof, will it not be proven, right? Or will it be considered
Correct.
a false accusation just because we did not have proof? And in various instances, IC members as well as the courts have also recognized that it's not always possible that we will always have the screenshots, or we will have some recordings on, or we'll be able to have some witness around to validate the claims that we are putting across in the allegations and in the complaint. So what do we say to that as a good practice? And number two is, let's identify a little bit on the cross investigation part also, wherein the law says that it's a right to both the parties. And I'm bringing in the bias again in picture here, where committee members usually provide this opportunity to the complainant but fail to educate the respondent on their rights, right? And the whole accountability of educating both the parties equally and with complete transparency is the accountability and responsibility of the committee members. Because just putting it in a policy document and expecting that inhe to pata hoga, they will know, if they want to provide witness, they would have provided witness. If they wanted to cross-examine any of the witness, then they would have asked for it. If they wanted any interim measure, they would have asked for it. I'm not doing an interim measure today, that's a separate topic altogether. But these all are parts of the proceedings which are there to protect the rights of both the parties. And how crucial it is, once again, as a good practice, that as you meet either of the parties, you have to, if need be, sit down with a checklist that whether we have educated them about this part, whether we have told them that they have the right to provide witness. If they have not provided witnesses, then go back to them and tell them that we notice that you have not mentioned any witness. So think about it. You have to also guide, because if you are representing yourself, you're not a trained and qualified lawyer, you will not know what kind of evidence you can provide, what kind of witness you can provide, what kind of material that you can submit to the committee to substantiate your claims, right? And this is something that needs to be done for both the parties in a clear manner.
Yeah, that's correct.
But how do we answer the first question? What exactly
Yeah.
do we tell team members when we are conducting our awareness sessions?
Yeah, so definitely the burden of proof differs in these kind of cases, right? So everything that can be substantiated should be able to be substantiated, and in some form or the other, any person coming forward with these complaints should have either witnesses who can corroborate or any proof, anything which is possible. In these cases, I feel that IC should, as you said, also in related to the second point, in fact, the IC should try to get into deeper of the end of the complaint, to see whether it is possible to find out more from the parties, whether there can be some substantiation. Because the rule of, the proof over here is not beyond reasonable doubt. It's the preponderance of probabilities. So if anything can be given from both the sides while following the other principles of natural justice, like we give both the parties equal amount of time to be heard. Everything that is shared by both of them is exchanged between both of them. Nothing that is retained by the IC thinking that it should not be shared with the other party. So these small aspects of proof, trying to dig deeper into it, trying to, through questioning with the people who are before it, either could be the parties to the complaint or the witnesses to the complaint, through that trying to understand what transpired between the complainant and the respondent. So a lot of time it's just he said, she said, right? It's not always possible. Sometimes if it happens behind closed doors, it's not always possible sometimes for some people to give evidence. In those cases, as much as possible, the parties try to collect it, or they try to corroborate through witnesses, or they at least get the help from the IC to question in these cases.
Right. And there's also the responsibility that IC members can always take up proactively, right? To look for witnesses on their own and to look for evidences on their own.
Yes, absolutely. This is where, it's their proactive nature which helps come to a conclusion which is why they've gotten 90 days for this investigation. They should not think and shut it down just because they feel that the parties could not substantiate it. Wherever they can dig deeper, wherever they can do a proactive role into digging deeper, they should be doing that. Wherever the parties can supply them with anything.
No, that's true. And that's why the law has given us 3 months, 90 days.
Yeah,
it's a long time to dig.
Yeah, and in our practical experiences, how many times we've seen Pallavi, so many times they just close the case within a week, thinking that isn't kuch bhi nahi hai. So this is not how ICs should be functioning. This is not a good practice, and generally leads up to cases like these, where the IC has not delved deeper into it and not seen wherever it can utilize its power to getting to a proper conclusion.
I know our favorite line to companies is please don't be one of the learnings in the form of judgments for other companies. That's not what you want to be, because this happens quite common that we miss out on certain crucial points. It's good to be patient. It's good to let things sink in. It's good to dig deeper before you come up with your final inquiry report and recommendation, because after that there's nothing that you can do internally. And if that person decides to take the matter someday to the court, everything that you have is in the form of case file and you cannot rework any of the document. And this is what it turns out to be then.
Yeah.
There's a question from Raj Fukan, but I will hold it, Suruchi, once we complete the second judgment also.
Yeah, it's the final and last judgment, and it should not take too long because it's quite a nuanced judgment. It's what we saw in our previous slide regarding the no bias or unfair treatment during investigation. It's about fair and unbiased treatment. Very, very quickly, going through the facts of the case, this is Dr. M. Rajendran versus M. Daisy Rani and others. It was before the High Court of Madras, the latest judgment of 2018. Now, what happened over here? So, M. Daisy Rani was working as a staff nurse at this Institute of Road Transport, and she filed a complaint of sexual harassment against the dean of the institute, M. Rajendra, the petitioner in our case, in 2016. However, no action was initiated on her complaint. She filed a writ petition before the Madras High Court to have the committee under POSH law to be constituted, and the order was granted in her writ petition, and the committee was constituted. Now, this petition, which has come before us, which we are right now reviewing, is by M. Rajendran, filing a review petition of the order of the M. Daisy Rani's petition to tell the court that in fact her sexual harassment complaint was a false complaint, and it was a counter attack for hiding the disciplinary proceedings which were pending against her for her misconduct in the organization. And the court was informed that there was already an internal committee existing in the institute, but the court did notice that this internal committee was formed by the dean himself. So how was it wrong? The court held that a committee which is formed by the dean, against whom the case has come up, cannot be allowed to proceed with the inquiry, because all of the people except for the external member are all subordinates of the dean in the institution. In fact, in this committee, there were 7 members. 6 of them happened to be subordinates of the dean, and the 7th member was the social welfare officer, who was independent of this. So the court held that the very objective of the act is to make sure that the truth behind the allegations come out. And how will the truth come out is by following the process under law and the whole principles of natural justice, which in case over here we see as a fair and unbiased outlook. Now, why would this committee not fall through that? Is because all the members in this committee were under the control of the dean. They were all subordinates. The whole committee was formed by the dean. The 6 members out of the 7 over here were all subordinates to the dean. So where there would be a very good, reasonable, and very good apprehension that the inquiry may be initiated because of the control of the dean being still there over the committee, because of them being subordinates. So for a fair and a free inquiry, a separate committee has to be constituted in such a kind of a case. And also because the dean raised the question in this petition that this was a counter attack over the disciplinary proceedings which were going on before, quite long before the sexual harassment complaint against the Daisy Rani, the complainant over here. So the court held that simply because such proceedings are pending, that does not mean that any complaint of sexual harassment could be reviewed simply because of that as a counterattack and simply to hide the previous proceedings. And they have to be adjudicated in a proper mechanism, properly by the internal committee which is constituted. So none of these statements of M. Rajendran, especially about the whole committee already being there, which we saw had the probability of being unfair and biased because of being under the control of the dean, because of being subordinates of the dean. There was complete apprehension of whether such inquiry would be free and fair. Therefore, these cannot, there has to be a separate constitution of the IC, and they have to be properly inquired into as per the provisions of the law. And the petition of M. Rajendran was dismissed. Yes. So we've come to the end of our judgments. Over here, we saw, of course, one very, very nuanced aspect of principles of natural justice, which is free and fair inquiry, making sure that it is fair and unbiased, because of nobody, especially because it was the complaint was against the dean, against the head of the institute, and so nobody could be under the control of that.
Once again, where the law has earlier stated also, right, that who are the members who should be part of the committee. I mean, a lot of companies come and ask us that, nowhere it is written that the employer or the board members cannot be part of the IC. Yes, nowhere it is written, but the very fact where it has said that it's the duty of the employer to nominate the members of the committee, you yourself cannot nominate yourself, right? And it's not everything is explicitly written. Some things are to be extracted from the intent of the law. With the responsibility given to nominate, I cannot nominate myself to be given the award or to be given the prominent position and so on and so forth.
Absolutely right, because it's, I think, one of the tenets of principles of natural justice is nobody should be a judge in its own cause.
Exactly.
So, which is there, if you, if the complaint is against you, you could not have formed the committee yourself, because that will be you being the judge in your own cause. So
True,
these
true.
are a few of the things that we see in these judgments, which are so sometimes we forget and they get out of our periphery. That these are small aspects which bring in a wrong inquiry process, which bring in an inquiry process which kind of already before its beginning also is tinted.
Yeah.
So there's no possibility of it being free and fair.
And you have to understand the essence of it, right? Suruchi, in practical cases, we have seen that some of the legal counsels of the organization, as external consultants, they have been put on part of the committees, or relatives or spouses of the
Yes.
owners of the business. They are part of the committees. Then we have also seen that individuals who have been, given stakes in the business. So there's a designation. Like just this morning somebody sent me a message in one of our external member group that can one of the director person from my organization, where this person was is advising, can that person be part of the committee? And the question that we need to identify is whether the director is just a designation, or whether director means having stakes and decision making power at the top level. And with that distinction, if you will be able to clearly identify whether you will be associated as an employer group for that specific entity or not. Right?
Yes, absolutely. Because that would again come up to this fact, right? Conflict of interest. That would lead to a very simple, very plain vanilla issue of conflict of interest, which again we've seen through a lot of judgments does not stand the test of law. Or any procedure which is done, the law is very clear about what is an employer, and the law is very clear about the employer cannot be on the panel. So there is a conflict of interest if anybody, even if is not of the employer but is related to the employer. So we have to
see the common practice is there that people will look out for individuals who will think for the benefit of the organization. Whereas when we are identifying external members specifically, it's very crucial to identify someone, one, who has a very in-depth hands-on experience of this law, right? Not just in terms of conducting awareness session, but also investigations and the documentation which is required, and how up to date they are on this particular law. Second thing is how well they understand the organizational nuances, right? It's one thing to understand women related issues from a domestic violence perspective to cyber crime and other things, but it's another thing to understand women related sexual harassment instances from a business perspective. Third thing is for you to identify whether they understand your industry, whether you're a hospitality industry or you're an aviation or manufacturing or farming or handicraft or whatever industry that you're part of, because then they will be able to see who your employees are, what all workplaces we are dealing with, how to cover everything from the document perspective, how to create awareness amongst the employee base, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, somebody who is actually fair, impartial, unbiased, and very gender neutral, because that one key external member will make sure that your rest of the committee members will behave exactly how they are supposed to be behaving. So instead of thinking that they should work or think for the benefit of the organization, if these four things are sorted, your organization's well-being is anyway taken care of.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So that's there. I'll take this question from Raj Fukan. Raj, sorry if I'm not pronouncing your last name correctly. You are free to correct me.
Okay.
I apologize in advance.
No issues.
So Raj is asking if you can shed more light on face-to-face confrontation between complainant and respondent. Is this a mandatory thing?
Well, are you taking the answer?
Sure, I'll start. So first and foremost, right to cross-examine is given to both the parties, and that is very clearly mentioned in the law. Second thing is, whether it's mandatory or not is something, it's, you cannot force either of the parties to go for cross investigation, but it is mandatory to present this as an option or as a possibility to both the parties. Now, what is given specifically to the complainant, being the aggrieved, is that they have the right to reject a face-to-face cross examination, and they can opt out of it. They cannot opt out of cross examination or cross questioning, but they can opt out of being in the same room with that person. So before any IC schedules any face-to-face cross-examination meeting, they need to seek the consent and need to ensure that the complainant is in a comfortable position to be able to go through this process. Just in case they are not, then it is advised that you still go ahead with the process, wherein the respondent can write down their questions and the IC can present these questions to the complainant, and the complainant's responses are to be documented and then again communicated to the respondent. It's a little more tedious thing, but there's no way that IC members can opt out of it. There's no way that the respondent will not have any questions that they would want to ask to the complainant, and that's how it should be. If this answered your question, Suruchi, you have anything to add here?
Yeah, no, absolutely correct, Pallavi. So in fact, there was another Delhi High Court judgment regarding this process also, where it gave this flexibility because of the whole sensitive nature of these complaints, right? A lot of complainants are not comfortable, a lot of parties are just not comfortable facing each other during this cross-examination process.
Right.
And this is where the IC gets that flexibility to put it all in writing. Yes, as Pallavi pointed out, it's a much tedious task, but it does the task. And it also makes sure that the parties, especially the complainant in these cases who have come forward with an instance of sexual harassment, are not put at a position where they feel uncomfortable. And again, this is also one of the issues in sexual harassment complaints, is creating a comfortable environment is also an essential thing for making sure that the cooperation is solicited properly from both the parties, especially from the complainant, and it properly goes with the procedure of the law, but with certain flexibilities wherever possible.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I basically asked this because, as I had mentioned in my previous interaction with you also, we are mostly dealing with daily rated workers or plain workers, as you can say. So there's a huge power imbalance between the complainant and the respondent, usually speaking. That's what we have found. And while our domestic inquiry cases, the normal domestic inquiry cases, we have this, so-called face-to-face cross-examination and things like that. But this being of a special nature, we have tried to avoid it. We go through, questioning one person and the other person, and we sort of do the cross-examination. So I'm not sure how good that is,
Raj, somewhere you should present this opportunity. In fact, you should clear it to both the parties, especially to the aggrieved, actually both the parties, not especially, both the parties, that there is a provision in the law where you get to ask questions to the other person. One, are you comfortable doing it in the presence of the committee? So you need to make sure that you're documenting all the comfort also that you're giving.
Yeah.
Right. The opportunity, yes.
Right, and extend as much comfort as possible, because see, the audience that you're talking about, they will not be able to ask. They're not vocal enough to ask you questions. Will you be there? Will I be protected? Will there be any retaliation? I have to face them. Maybe they, even if that person is senior enough and sitting in some other office, they may have contacts at the ground level that may actually create a retaliatory environment for them. So you have to present all these comforting information to them. And I'm sure the documentation process is happening for every meeting. What it allows you to do is, someday, worst case scenario, if someone opens up the case file on this particular matter, when they're reading through the minutes of the conversation, it automatically tells, because we do it on a day-to-day basis, right? When you read the conversations, you're crossing things out that, okay, the committee did provide all the comfort, the committee did present, because these are the nuances that will get picked up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other question from any other person? Okay, I don't see any other question, Suruchi. Perhaps.
Yeah, I think we've covered everything and covered our question also. We would request you to please in the chat box we've just shared a link for a feedback form. Kindly fill that up. We would also it also requires to let us know what you're looking forward to and what brings you over here. We would request you to take just few minutes to fill that form, and then we can close the session.
Yes, someone wanted to discuss Justice Gogoi's case. That's a discussion of a judgment. That's a discussion of the whole legal system in our country.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Colonel Safari. Really appreciate. We'll look forward to all of you joining us in our future sessions. I have also shared the link from our website, where we keep updating the calendar and the weekend sessions every month. So you can block your calendars in advance, and you can block the registration seats also in advance. Now that we are getting to know all of you a little bit more, by every session, it also makes it interesting for us, and we'll look forward to interacting more with all of you. I think we are good, Suruchi. Have a lovely weekend, all of you.
Have a lovely weekend, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Ambali. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi and Suruchi.
Oh, thank
you.
We look forward to seeing you all in the next session.
Yes. See you soon.